Christ is risen. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
This past week was a strange week. It was like the morning after. We've had a beautiful, uplifting, festive Easter service, a baby baptized, welcomed formally into the family, and a new member joined the congregation. So as we started to reflect, it was rather strange. The words to the hymn, "What have I to dread, what have I to fear," kept coming into my mind, but I couldn't figure out why. And this went on for a couple of days. And finally, Thursday morning, very early, the answer came. I have no idea where it came from. Perhaps it was a spirit. I'm not sure. But it occurred to me that one of the reasons for that unsettling feeling was that Wednesday was the 56th anniversary of the assassination and death of Martin Luther King Jr. It hit me in such a way because of the way that happened and where I was in my journey. We had become engaged the prior December, and I was in St. Louis, and my fiancée was in Washington, D.C. So at spring break that year, I traveled back to Washington, D.C. so that we could spend some time together. I don't know if you've been in Washington, D.C. in the springtime. Have you? It is a beautiful place. Despite all of the rhetoric, despite all of the talk that's going on, they have cherry blossoms in bloom. There are flowers everywhere. And believe it or not, people are even friendly. Maybe that's because they come from all over the nation and are not necessarily there in the capital district. But people actually smile. So I traveled back and reached the city that afternoon around 3 or 4 o'clock. My fiancée was still in class, and I waited for her outside of that physics building. And when she came out, we of course wanted to visit the downtown area of the government district there, just to take in some of the beauty, some of the flowers, the spring weather, warm in the day but cool in the evening. And then we decided to go to a movie while we were there. It's a strange place because movies there play all times of the day, almost like Broadway in New York. You can get a movie at 12:30 a.m. in the morning, or you can get one at 4 a.m. in the morning. They just play all the time. Ideal for people who have crazy schedules. So we took in a movie. Not quite in the government building, as I indicated, in the government district, but closer to the university, which is northwest. And as we went into the theater, we were there for about 15 or 20 minutes when the house lights came on and the manager came out on the stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am sorry to announce to you that Martin Luther King Jr. has been shot and died down in Memphis this evening." And as he said that, we heard loud shouts and breaking glass coming from the front of the lobby of the building. And the manager went on to say, "Please get down and please exit the theater in the rear of the theater. Exit from the stage. Please don't go up front. Walk to the rear of the building and walk to the next street over. And there, perhaps your car is parked or you can get public transportation. But do not go to the front of this building." And as he said that, and as we left that auditorium, we heard loud shouts and people coming into the building. It took us about 15 or 20 minutes to reach my fiancée's apartment. And by the time we got there, there were guards on the street where she lived. We saw trucks bringing in National Guardsmen. We saw the DC police coming in all directions. But we also saw people streaming into the streets. We got into her apartment building, and for the first time in her history, as she tells it, she had to show ID to get into her own building. We went up to the 8th floor where her apartment was, and there were 3 other students. She had a roommate who had brought in 2 additional students, and they were sitting there in silence, looking out the windows, looking out over the city from the 8 stories up. They were in silence. They didn't quite know what to say. And it took us a time to get into the apartment, even though she had a key. Her key only opened one lock. They had to come and take the bolts off the door so that we could get in. And as they sat there in silence, there was this gloom. There was fear. And eventually we started to talk. And we found out that they, like myself and like my fiancé, had lost something in that assassination. Not unlike the disciples who were in the upper room, afraid, having lost an essential part of their life, having lost hope, having lost something of their future. And we sat there, staring out the windows, hearing the sirens, looking at fires that were popping up all over the district. But because we were at the university and had been there, and I had been there as well for 2 years, we knew where the fires were. The fires were not in the government district. The fires were not in the high-rent districts. The fires were in the poorer districts. We were afraid to go to sleep that evening because we never knew when we might have to leave the apartment 8 stories up because of the fire. But we sat there, staring out the windows. Finally, daylight came. You hear me often say the sun will come up tomorrow, and it is because of certain experiences, certain parts of my faith journey that I appreciate. The sun did come up the next morning, and as the sun came up, we started to see all of the damage that had been done. We saw the results of anger. We saw the results of oppression. We saw the results of mistrust. But these students, 2 of them were medical students and 1 graduate student, said, "We're not going to sit here all day. Our futures may or may not be disrupted. We don't know. We know that because of a dream, our families, our parents, and our communities had committed income and their well wishes and their support to us. We're not going to sit here today." And so we got up and we walked out of the building. Curfew was lifted. And we walked throughout the neighborhoods, surrounding the university and surrounding other things, other parts of the city. The medical students joined with the ETMS people to offer or to help with first aid. Some of us just decided to talk with people who had been displaced because their apartments and their homes had been burned. What could we say? We didn't know what we would say, but we could only offer prayers and our good wishes and just listen to what people were saying. That was the day after. That was what happened after the curfew was lifted. But it didn't end there. There were arrests and there were trials, there were all sorts of things. The university itself expelled several students who were on national TV who had been shown to participate in the rioting and in this insurrection. But that was the result, again, of fear. That was the result of oppression. Violence, as you know, is never justified in times like that. All during the evening, and perhaps tonight for the next week or so, things were very tenuous. Things were unsettling. But people continued to live their lives. Across the nation, riots, insurrection, acts of insurrection occurred in major cities. So this morning, it should be easy, certainly for me, to understand that evening of the first Easter, when the disciples were in the upper room, probably the same room where they had held the Last Supper with their leader, Jesus. They shut the door, they bolted it, they locked it. They also were afraid. They could not get their bearings. They were disoriented. They could not even breathe easily. These disciples had given up everything to follow Jesus, and this is not how they expected things to turn out. A week ago, on Palm Sunday, almost 2 weeks now, they had entered the city. They had entered with high hopes, but now there was a disaster. Things looked crazy. They felt unsafe. Their faith had been reversed. They had had the wind knocked out of them. And on that first Easter evening, Jesus came, however, to see them. He walked right through the door without unlocking it, without them opening it. And when he walked through the door, he breathed new life into the room. At one time or another, perhaps all of us are like this. Perhaps all of us have had life or had breath locked out of us. We too, like those students on that 8th floor, had initially thought that the wind was gone and that things were over. In times like today, and back even in 1968, the big picture that we have for our lives, for our experiences, tend to fade away because we're cast into positions of survival. And then when one goes into a survival condition, it's impossible to think about other things, those grand things, to even think about the future. Here is a connection that I want you to make or think about in terms of the connection between this situation, between Dr. King and between Thomas, and between the judgments that we make in our lives each and every day. As we look at the scriptures, as we look at those passages, all three of them, it becomes immediately obvious that Thomas got a bad rap. When you hear the word Thomas, you think automatically doubting Thomas. But perhaps Thomas had it right. Perhaps Thomas was the one who would ask the right questions in spite of his faith. Asking the question did not make him faithless. Thomas was a twin, as we all know, and he had often been mistaken for his twin brother walking on the beach. Thomas was not in the room when Jesus reappeared, as we heard in the passages earlier. Thomas would always ask the question, who will be hurt by the actions that we take? Are we being faithful to our leader, Jesus? When Jesus returned to the room a week later and Thomas was present, Thomas did not have to ask him to touch his wounds. Jesus went immediately to him and told him to put his hands on the side, or on his hands, or on his feet. The passages don't record whether or not Thomas in fact did this. But Thomas realized, as we realize today, that there are two sides to a coin. One of faith one of goodness and one of sin and evil. But Thomas, instilled by courage by his disciples and certainly by Jesus, got it right. His doubt was in fact a part of who he is or who he was. We remember that Thomas, like all the disciples, was eventually killed, all except one. Thomas went to India, and some passages in the historical text records that Thomas also went to China, but his main focus was the establishment of the Christian church in India. And it was in India, while preaching and praying, kneeling at an altar, that Thomas was killed. Does that sound like a doubting Thomas to you? Or does it sound like someone who got it right? Despite the questions that I may ask, despite the proof that I may require, I still was on the path of faithfully living into who Jesus had called me to be. Today, or last Wednesday, or even today, we can remember the work that Dr. King did, especially in this area and in Birmingham, Alabama. He wrote a letter from the jail in Birmingham, from the city jail there, to answer critics among the clergy, asking him if this was the right time and can't you wait. Dr. King wrote a classic letter now that every seminary student, every philosophy student has to read and study. And the question asks, essentially, what is the role of the church? What is the role of God's spokesman? To the embarrassment of several denominations who signed that letter to Dr. King, they now regret it 50-some years later, because it did not show the church in its best light. The church is expected to be a leader, not a follower. But the decisions that were made, the impressions that were made at that time, were impressions at the moment. While today the whole world, certainly the church and the nation, recognizes the importance and the contribution and the goodness of God's call to Dr. King, it was not always that way. He was called an outside agitator. People attempted to kill him. Even at my time at the university, people came into the city to burn his house down, right there near the campus of the university. He was considered, again, the outside agitator. But that was the judgment of the moment. And so, our call today is to be careful about how we judge and the names that we assign to things and certainly to people. For the names that we assign today are basically what we think and what we feel today, but those things have changed. The names and the feeling toward Martin Luther changed. He was considered an agitator. He had to be protected by royalty and by wealthy people in Germany, because there was a warrant for his death that was issued. We remember Mahatma Gandhi for his work in helping free millions of people in India from the colonialism of Great Britain. Today we remember that Mother Teresa was always not held in high esteem. People thought she was crazy. We also remember Nelson Mandela, not from what you're hearing on TV these days, but how his leadership in South Africa, even though he was jailed, how that leadership prevented a massive war that would have resulted in the death and injuries of millions and millions of people. To love our God with all our hearts, all our souls, and all our minds is what we're called to do, even love our enemies. And so we say again, we must be careful in the judgments that we assign and the names that we give. Proof is what all of us would like to have, because we live in a science age. but proof that we know is not necessarily sufficient. In the scientific world, we say that the proof and the evidence that we see and that we gather is necessary, but it's not sufficient. God is always changing things, and God is always moving us to different places. We live in an age of wonder, in an age of miracles. When it comes to resurrection faith, ours is not a dispensation of sight. We cannot be present for everything that is important in this world. We're not even present for everything that is important in our own lives. Life is short. So be kind, be considerate, judge not, lest ye be judged. I speak these words to you today in the name of God, the Father, loving Father, creating Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.